When most people think of Alcatraz, they picture dramatic escape attempts, hardened gangsters, and maybe that one Clint Eastwood movie. Hollywood has turned the Rock into this almost mythical place, a fortress of pure punishment where America's most dangerous criminals were locked away and forgotten. But here's the thing. The reality of daily life inside Alcatraz wasn't really about dramatic confrontations or constant violence. It was something far more unsettling. It was about routine, endless, crushing, soul-numbing routine, the kind of monotony that could break a man faster than any physical punishment ever could. Today, we're going to strip away the Hollywood mythology and take you inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary as it actually was between 1934 and 1963. We'll walk through a typical day as an inmate, explore what you'd eat, where you'd sleep, what rules governed every minute of your existence, and perhaps most importantly, what this place did to a person's mind. Before we dive in, if you enjoy history content that goes beyond the surface and really explores what life was actually like in the past, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. We're working toward €1 subscribers, and every single one of you who joins helps us keep making videos like this. So if this sounds like your kind of content, hit that subscribe button and let's get into it. Imagine this. You've just spent years in another federal prison, maybe Leavenworth or Atlanta, and you've caused enough trouble that the Bureau of Prisons has decided you need to be sent somewhere special. Somewhere you can't cause problems anymore. You're shackled, loaded onto a train, and transported across the country. Eventually, you find yourself on a boat crossing the San Francisco Bay, watching the city lights fade behind you as you approach a cold, fog-shrouded island. That was the first thing inmates noticed about Alcatraz. You could see freedom. San Francisco was only about 1.5 miles away. On quiet nights, prisoners claimed they could hear music and laughter drifting across the water from the city's clubs and parties. This wasn't an accident. Warden James Johnston, who ran Alcatraz during its early years, believed that proximity to normal life would serve as constant psychological torture. You weren't in some remote wasteland. You were right there, close enough to practically taste freedom, yet completely unable to reach it. When you arrived, you were stripped, searched, examined by doctors, and assigned a number. At Alcatraz, you weren't a person anymore. You were a number. Al Capone, the most famous gangster in American history, was simply Inmate 85. Machine Gun Kelly was number 117. Your identity was gone. Your new home was a cell measuring roughly 5 feet by 9 feet. That's smaller than most walk-in closets. Inside you had a cot with a thin mattress, a toilet, a small sink, a fold-down table, a fold-down seat, and a few shelves. That was it. The cells were stacked in blocks. B block and C block held most of the general population, with about 336 cells total. But Alcatraz rarely held more than 260 to 275 inmates at any given time. This was intentional. Unlike overcrowded prisons on the mainland where inmates shared cells or lived in dormitories, every man at Alcatraz got his own cell. This sounds like a privilege until you realize the purpose. Isolation. Fewer opportunities to conspire, plan escapes, or organize. The cells were cold. San Francisco Bay created a constant chill that seeped through the concrete walls. Inmates were issued wool blankets, but many still complained of the cold, particularly during winter months when fog would roll in and sit on the island for days. And then there was D Block, the isolation unit. If you broke the rules, you could find yourself in the hole, completely stripped cells with no light, no furniture, and minimal food. Inmates in the hole might spend days in total darkness, fed only bread and water, with occasional full meals to keep them alive. The psychological effect was devastating. At Alcatraz, every minute of your day was scheduled. This wasn't an exaggeration. Guards literally tracked time to the minute. At 6:30 a.m., a loud buzzer would wake the entire cell house. You had 20 minutes to dress, make your bed to exact specifications, and prepare for the morning count. Guards would walk the cell block, counting every single inmate multiple times throughout the day. If the count was off by even one person, the entire prison went into lockdown until every inmate was accounted for. At 6:50 a.m., cell doors would rack open with a thunderous metallic crash. All at once, controlled by a single lever. You'd step out onto the walkway and march in line to the mess hall for breakfast. Meals at Alcatraz were actually surprisingly good compared to other prisons. Warden Johnston believed that food was one of the few things that could prevent riots. Inmates ate real eggs, bacon, fresh bread, fruit, vegetables, and quality meat. The kitchen was staffed by inmates, and meals were served family-style at long tables. You had 20 minutes to eat. No talking at first. The silent system was strictly enforced during Alcatraz's early years, meaning inmates couldn't speak to each other except during designated recreation periods. Imagine that, sitting in a room with over 200 men, eating in complete silence except for the sounds of metal trays and chewing. Some inmates later said this silence was more oppressive than anything else about Alcatraz. After breakfast, you'd march to your work assignment. Most inmates had jobs: the laundry, the kitchen, the furniture factory, maintenance crews. Work wasn't optional. If you refused to work, you'd find yourself in D block. The laundry was actually one of the busiest operations, processing not just prison uniforms but military laundry from nearby bases. It was hot, exhausting work, but inmates often preferred it to sitting in their cells doing nothing. Alcatraz operated under what officials called the maximum security, minimum privilege system. You earned privileges through good behavior, but even the privileges were limited. In the early years, inmates weren't allowed to have newspapers or radios. They had no idea what was happening in the outside world. Letters were strictly limited, usually 1 or 2 per week, and every single piece of mail was censored. Guards would literally cut out any information deemed inappropriate or potentially useful for escape planning. Visits were rare. Family members could visit, but conversations happened through glass partitions with guards listening to every word. The slightest mention of anything suspicious would get your visit terminated immediately. The rules governed everything: how you walked, how you stood during count, how you held your utensils, how you made your bed. Breaking minor rules earned demerits. Accumulate enough demerits and you'd lose privileges: yard time, library access, the ability to buy items from the commissary. Major infractions sent you straight to D block. One former inmate later recalled getting written up for failing to button his top shirt button. Another was disciplined for walking too slowly to the mess hall. The pettiness was intentional. Total control meant total control over every detail. Despite the crushing routine, inmates did have some outlets. The recreation yard, a concrete courtyard on the south side of the island, was open during weekends and some afternoons. Here, prisoners could play softball, bridge, dominoes, or simply walk around and talk. For many inmates, the yard was the only thing that kept them sane. It was the only place where something approximating normal human interaction could happen. Cliques formed around card games and sports teams. Friendships, or at least alliances, developed. The library was another escape. Alcatraz had a surprisingly good collection of books, and inmates were allowed to request titles. Many men became voracious readers, working their way through novels, history books, and educational materials. Some inmates used their time to educate themselves, teaching themselves languages or mathematics. And there was music. Later in Alcatraz's history, inmates were allowed to purchase musical instruments. A prison band formed, practicing in the basement of the cell house. On weekends, you could sometimes hear the sound of guitars, horns, and drums drifting through the corridors. It was one of the few signs that human beings, not just numbers, lived inside those walls. But nothing could fully counteract what Alcatraz did to a person's mind. The combination of isolation, rigid routine, proximity to freedom, and the knowledge that you were considered one of America's worst criminals took a devastating toll. Depression was rampant. Some inmates became completely withdrawn, refusing to speak or interact with anyone. Others developed what guards called rock fever, a kind of psychological breakdown characterized by anxiety, paranoia, and sometimes violent outbursts. Several inmates deliberately injured themselves to be transferred to medical facilities on the mainland. At least a few attempted suicide. One man, Roof Persfool, used a fire axe to chop off the fingers on his left hand while working in the prison garage, a desperate attempt to escape his circumstances, even if only through physical trauma. Perhaps the most famous case of psychological breakdown was that of Al Capone himself. The former crime boss who had once controlled Chicago arrived at Alcatraz as a celebrity. but the island quickly stripped away his power and identity. He spent years in quiet decline, showing signs of syphilis-induced dementia, but also the effects of the crushing isolation. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shadow of the man who had once terrified a nation. If there was one thing former inmates consistently described as the most haunting aspect of Alcatraz, it was the combination of silence and fog. The fog would roll in from the Pacific, sometimes sitting on the island for days at a time, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Inside the cell house, the silence of the early years, when talking was prohibited, created an eerie, oppressive atmosphere. Even after the silent rules were relaxed, Alcatraz was never loud. Sound didn't carry well through the concrete and steel, and there was nowhere for noise to go. Inmates described lying in their cells at night, listening to the foghorns and the distant sounds of San Francisco. Some claimed they could hear New Year's Eve celebrations from the city, crowds cheering, music playing, while they lay alone in their cold, dark cells. That juxtaposition, freedom close enough to hear but impossible to reach, captured everything about Alcatraz. It wasn't designed to simply contain prisoners. It was designed to break them through monotony, isolation, and the constant reminder of what they had lost. By 1963, Alcatraz was becoming too expensive to operate. The island had no natural resources. Everything, including fresh water, had to be shipped in. The buildings were deteriorating from saltwater corrosion. Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered the prison closed. The last inmates were transferred off the island on March 21, 1963. The cells went empty. The mess hall fell silent. Today, Alcatraz is a tourist attraction, visited by over 1 million people each year. Visitors walk through the cell house, peer into the tiny cells, and try to imagine what it felt like to live there. But no tour can truly convey the weight of 23 hours a day in a 5x9 cell. The silence, the fog, the proximity of freedom, and the slow erosion of identity. For the men who served time on the Rock, Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a machine designed to grind them down through routine, isolation, and the unbearable nearness of a world they could see but never touch. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about what it would actually be like to wake up every morning in that cell, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. We're building something here, a community of people who genuinely love history, not just the highlight reel, but the real, lived experiences of people in the past. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one makes a difference. So if you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe, and while you're at it, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about life inside Alcatraz? What aspect would you have found hardest to endure? Let's get a conversation going. Thank you for watching.